Today I come to the end of a three-part series of messages on 2 Timothy. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. With those words, the Apostle Paul commends himself to Timothy and to the whole Christian community throughout the ages. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Some scholars who read this text understand it to be kind of the last will and testament of the great Apostle Paul, the missionary apostle who went about preaching and teaching and reaching out to people countless places throughout his entire ministry. As he's looking back at this point in his life, he's wondering about what it all amounts to. What was the meaning of it all? What was the value of everything that he has done? What is the thing that he's accomplished through this ministry of preaching and teaching that he has embarked on over these years? And as he looks at his life and he sees what the future has in store, I'm sure he must have had all kinds of wonderment about it. What really is going to happen in the years to come? As for Paul, he knew what was going to happen to him because he was in prison. And he had been totally abandoned by all of his friends except for Luke. And there he was, in prison, just awaiting that time when he would be brought before the emperor for his appeal to the emperor. And he'd be put on trial. I'm sure falsely accused, ultimately condemned, and then put to death as a Roman citizen. He knew what his future was, but I'm sure he was concerned about what was the future for the church that he had poured out his life for over the past 30 years. He could have been discouraged. He could have become depressed. He could have become angry. He could have been fearful. But none of those things seem to apply to the apostle. Instead, he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And now there awaits me a crown, which God will give not only to me, but to all who have been longing for his coming. Every time I look up when I'm preaching, I see that circle there. And chances are you've been in church many, many times and you've looked at that and said, what in the world is that anyway? Why do we have that circle hanging in the middle of the sanctuary? I wonder if anybody else anywhere has one like that. And as I thought about this text, I thought, well, maybe we could think of that as the crown of glory, which hangs over us all, which is going to be bestowed upon all of us who are longing for his appearing. After all, when a runner finished the race, he would be crowned with a laurel wreath made of leaves placed upon his head. But lest I go astray, let me just get back to where I was going. When the apostle is looking at the future, he could have been discouraged. He could have given up, but he didn't. And that's what intrigues me the most. What is it that enabled him to keep his faith? What made it possible for him to finish the race? In what sense did he fight the good fight and win in the end? What made it possible? There are three things at least that I think made it possible for him to have confidence in the face of the future. First of all, he had experienced personally the grace of God in his own life. He'd experienced that grace of God reaching out to him and calling him into the presence of God's people. You know, he started out as a scholar and a student of the scriptures. He started out as a Pharisee, a very religious man, but nevertheless a very faithful Jewish person. But then he saw what was happening with the Jesus movement, and he became concerned about the future. And so he went to the high priest. He got letters of arrest, warrants that he could take with him to Damascus, and headed out on a journey to Damascus, where with these arrest warrants he could pick up all those followers of the way who had migrated over to Damascus, bring them back to Jerusalem, have them put on trial before the Sanhedrin, and perhaps even condemned to death and killed. That was his mission. But as he was on the way to Damascus, you know how the story goes. He was encountered by the risen Christ, who came to him and said, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul recognized what was going on, and that this was the Lord. And that event turned his entire life around. And so ultimately he became a missionary who then for 30 years went about to so many different places, mostly on foot, sometimes by ship, preaching and teaching and reaching out to all sorts of people, all kinds of people, all religions of people, in so many different places. And time again, he got different results. Some people responded enthusiastically, joyfully. They received the gospel that he proclaimed. But there were many others who did not. And so he suffered many beatings. He suffered some stonings. He had the 39 lashes, the 40 lashes less one on several occasions. He was beaten with rods. He was imprisoned. He was forced to starve while he was in prison, and take all the abuse that would be given to somebody who was in that state. Even endured and survived a shipwreck. And on top of all of that, he had his concern for the churches in which Christians were not getting along with one another, and so he had to deal with that kind of conflict and problem amongst the Christian community as well. So the Apostle Paul endured great suffering. And what made it possible for him to survive it all? He heard the voice of Jesus saying to him, "My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness." And so regardless of what he had to encounter, and regardless of what kind of trials he had to endure, he experienced the grace of God. I can relate to that very well, because as a pastor and just as a follower of Jesus like you, I've experienced in many cases a lot of that kind of stress. And again in my life I've experienced how God's grace has touched my life and made it possible for me to keep on and keeping the faith. Second thing that I think was at work here for the Apostle Paul was the fact that he believed completely, absolutely, in the power of the gospel itself. Recall those words which were my confirmation verse. Pastors give out confirmation verses at confirmation to each one who was confirmed. My confirmation verse was Romans 1:16, where Paul writes to the Romans, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who has faith, to the Jew and also to the Gentile," which means everyone, of course. The gospel has power. And that power is able to transform the lives of people. Just as it had transformed Paul's life, that power is there to change the lives of people. And as a pastor, I have to say that over the past 40-something years that I've been a pastor, on many occasions, in many different lives, in many different ways, I have seen the power of God changing people's lives. Some people change rather dramatically, rather quickly. Other people you have to be very patient with. But that power is in the gospel itself. The good news of Jesus Christ, his death, his resurrection for us all. The promise of God that he will save us. And that's what has changed the lives of so many people that I've known and shared life with over all of these years. Like Paul, I have found that the gospel is indeed the power of God to salvation to everyone who has faith. And for that I give thanks, as he did. The third thing I think that was really important for Paul, as he looked towards the future, as he realized that he would soon be off the scene completely, was the fact that this mission that he had been on for these 30 years was ultimately not his mission, but God's mission. That he was part of a much bigger enterprise, that it was much more than just what he set out to do. It was much more than his vision, his plan, his set of priorities. This was God's work. And his were just the hands that did it, and the voice that spoke it. And that's such a relief for those of us who take very seriously this mission that we are engaged in together, to know that the mission does not ultimately depend upon us. We do not have to be a savior. God has already given us one. And we have the ability then to carry out that mission in the world, in those various places, and those many, many different places in which we find ourselves as followers of Jesus. That mission is his mission. And so that mission, in the end, will never fail. What comfort and encouragement that gives to us who follow after Jesus, knowing that the mission that God is working on is something that he will bring about to completion. Now, there's certain irony about this whole letter in that he is addressing Timothy. And if you knew Timothy, you would see that's probably the last person that you would pick out of a crowd to entrust the job that Paul was turning over in the coming years. Timothy was young. He was relatively inexperienced in the world. He had a weak stomach, a lot of sniffles. And to top it all off, he was very shy. Last person you'd pick for that kind of a job, to send out to take on the task of bringing the gospel to all nations, would be someone like Timothy. And yet, in God's great sense of humor, God had in mind that he could do a miracle through Timothy, just as he had done a miracle through Paul. And so Timothy was set aside. And Paul wrote this letter to encourage him to keep on with the mission that had been entrusted to him. As we look to the future together as a congregation, pastor and people together, seeking to be faithful to God in this particular place and in other places as well, how important it is for us to know that this is God's work that we are engaged in. It's more than just coming to church. It's more than just putting an offering in the plate. It's more than just saying a prayer. It is a life that we share in the gospel. Just as Paul poured out his life for the sake of the people, we offer our lives as a sacrifice to God so that God might accomplish great things through us. So fight the good fight. Finish the race. Keep the faith. And receive the crown that God has for you. Amen.